So, and it's because people are scared. Well, what are they scared of? I mean, the greatest threat in this town is maybe a cat will be lost or something like that. But people are scared, so they have to have alarms and this, that, and the other thing. And yes, they're afraid, and that's fostered. But it's part of something much broader, I think. It's part of the effort to break down solidarity and sympathy. And that shows up in all kinds of ways. Like take privatizing schools. What's the point of privatizing schools? Well, the idea is to instill in people the idea that all you care about is yourself. So I don't happen to have children of school age, so therefore, according to the ideology that's implanted in you, I'm not supposed to care whether the kid down the street has school to go to. So I don't want to pay taxes. I want to cut taxes because I don't care if that kid goes to school. And if, since I have enough money, I could send my kid to private school if I wanted to, so who cares if they're public schools? So we should privatize schools to eliminate the conception that we should care if some other kid goes to school, which everybody has. So you got to drive it out of their heads. The same is true, I don't know if it's happening here, of efforts to privatize pension and security systems. What's the point of that? Like in the U.S., these big effort to try to privatize Social Security. I mean, financially speaking, it's ridiculous. It's a huge cost and everything else. But there are reasons for it. Social Security is based on an unacceptable principle, namely that that you should care if the disabled widow across town survives. And you're not supposed to care about that. You're supposed to care about whether you have enough pairs of shoes and stuff like that, and, enough cars and video games or whatever it is. That's all you're supposed to care about. So you got to privatize Social Security. Also, another advantage to privatizing Social Security is that it has the brilliant consequence of turning working people against their own interests. Because if your pension is tied up in stocks, you want to make sure those stocks go up. And the way those stocks go up is by cutting wages and reducing working conditions and, sending jobs to, Chinese sweatshops and so on. So as a working person, you have to be committed to undermining your own interests. And that's important. So for reasons like that, you want to privatize Social Security and privatize water and schools and everything else, and also make people afraid of each other. So you should be afraid of the people next door, so you should pour your money into alarm systems that the police aren't paying any attention to. It's all idiotic, and so on and so forth. Yeah, these are ways of controlling people. And fear is one of them. That's why fear of crime is so high in the United States. It's not because of crime. It's because it's manufactured.
And when you see the activist groups, and they say, what can we do? I mean, all that you've described is so discouraging. What can we do? And he, I think, if I can use the word inspiring, he says exactly what you're doing. You've got to keep things active, essentially lead an activist life.
So the global justice movements, which wanted to take a different form, they are a completely new phenomenon. Never been anything like them. It started in the South. So the main centers are India and Brazil and places like that. And 10 or 15 years later, it reached the North. When it got to the streets of Seattle, you had to start paying attention to it. As long as it's just a couple 100,000 Indian peasants demonstrating at Parliament, who cares about that? But and it's now international. So at Porto Alegre in the World Social Forum meetings, I was down there last February. There's people from all over, the 70,000 people or so, all over the world, every possible walk of life, every interest and concern you can imagine. Very lively, energetic, interesting, and they reflect activism all over the world, from campesinos to environmentalists to anything you can think of. And that's an entirely new phenomenon. It's sort of, in a sense, you could imagine it's the beginnings of the realization of what was the main goal of the workers' movements and the left 150 years ago, namely a genuine international. There's never been one, and the seeds of them were quickly destroyed. But this is really taking off, and it is a reflection of things happening everywhere.
If I look back on the life of activism of most of my friends who are activists, the key thing that people got from going out to coffee shops and talking to Chomsky and listening to him and getting a chance to have one-on-one conversations or a few people getting together was that he sort of, the foundation of how to approach an issue, the building blocks of how to think about something, Chomsky really gave those to us.
The country's just become a lot more civilized, and so has a good deal of the West, and it wasn't given as a gift. Any more than civil rights were or anything else, or labor rights or anything you can think of. These are the results of constant struggle. And the options are perfectly well open to us, much more open to us than to most people in the world. We've got an enormous amount of freedom thanks to the achievements of our predecessors who struggled to win that freedom. And now we have it, and that gives us opportunities that most people in the world just don't have. Like you try to speak up for freedom of speech in Turkey, as many people courageously do, you can end up in a Turkish prison, which isn't a lot of fun. You try to do it in one of the U.S. client states in Latin America, you can get your brains blown out. In Colombia, for example. We don't have those problems. So for us to talk, there's no problem in carrying out activities, and we've got plenty of opportunities. It's succeeded in the past. There's no reason why it shouldn't continue to. So I don't see any problem there. In fact, I think it's the best period for organizing and activism that I can remember, at least in my lifetime.
How do you talk to people without alienating them and still encouraging people to address power dynamics without making it too theoretical?
Well, don't you think that these things are just normal aspects of everybody's life, which can be described in their own terms? After all, we're not, as far as I know, we're not bringing up any particularly sophisticated concepts that you can't talk about to children. Yeah. Well, does the average person not understand things about, sexual abuse or, bosses giving orders that you don't like, and, all the destroying the environment? I think these are things that are everybody's concerns. If they're not, it's because they're just not, they don't have the time or energy or whatever to think about them. Well, those of you who are organizers should speak up. Do you really, do you teach people or do you learn from them? Part of being on the left at that time was bringing what we call high culture, science, mathematics, the arts, and so on, to people who didn't have the advantages of the privileges of going through school. Going through school then meant even maybe getting to 4th grade. And it could certainly be done. It ends up, people want it, they like it, they participate in it, they go on by themselves. And those of us, all of us who are privileged, one of the responsibilities is to help people do this for themselves.
How do we get people to liberate themselves? How do we get people to collectively organize? How do we liberate people from racism and sexism? It starts, it's a cliche to say it starts inside you, but it's just like when you start thinking in terms of that, in terms of other people and what they need, that's when you get into the realm of theorizing about ideal communities and societies, and not asking, well, why am I asking this question now? What was the discussion previous to this? What's my role as a class, middle class, upper class, whatever, gender, sexual orientation, whatever. And I think that's a really easy trap for university-oriented activists to fall into. What's the ideal solution for everyone? What's the utopia? And how you get people to understand our vision and go there. Well, why aren't we going to places? Instead of saying, why aren't people here? Let's bring them in here. Let's use our privilege to extend us to everybody. Teach the world. That's colonialism. It's why don't we just...
Well, is it colonialism if, let's say, I suppose I know mathematics and I go into a working class area and help people learn mathematics? Is that colonialism?
Okay, now that's a loaded question, right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's what workers' education is.
Now, I'm not painting
I mean, I've got
all
to...
workers' education with the brush of colonialism.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that for you to do that without interrogating your privilege, right?
I'm abandoning it, but I'm saying I'm going to use it. Look, I'm not denying that I have it. I'm not going to pretend that I'm a poor Korean immigrant who can't speak English. I'm not. Nor am I going to pretend that I can work in a rape crisis center. I can't. I mean, I'm myself. I'm not some other person. And the question is whether being who you are, whoever you are, without denying that that's who you are, you can do something useful for other people. I'm sure we're not disagreeing. We can't deny who we are. Like, I'm not going to go organize steel workers because I just can't. In order to do it, I have to become a steel worker, and then I got to undo my whole background and start over from age 1. And I'm not going to do that, and there wouldn't be any point in my doing it.
I appreciated his citing how much progress we've made in individual rights and freedoms in the last 40 years. It's good to be reminded of that, and because we get so bogged down. I get so bogged down. It's great to hear him push for a more popular struggle and know that, it does make a difference.
There's a reason why we're much more free, and there's a lot more justice now than there was in the past. There's a reason why human rights are much better protected. Actually, there's a reason why the Wilsonian intellectuals had to turn to propaganda as a technique of manipulation and control because force wasn't available any longer. The reason is popular struggles over many years, which have just improved things enormously, just as they have in the last few years. Trilateral Commission intellectuals were worried about the ferment of the 60s and the excess of democracy. There's been many attempts to try to figure out how to crush it and to restore the indoctrination of the young, but they haven't worked. There's been much more activism and engagement and, in fact, progress in many dimensions in the last 20 or 30 years. So, for example, if you go back to the 1960s, just remember what things were like. There was barely any feminist movement. Women's rights sort of an issue way out at the margins. There was no environmental movement. Nobody cared about protecting an environment. There were no third world solidarity movements. There was no anti-nuclear movement. There was no global justice movement, these massive movements which really are very significant. There was no opposition to aggression. It was considered just fine. So the protests now over the coming war in Iraq are absolutely unique. They have no historical precedent, at least that I can think of. I can't think of another case in the entire history of European imperialism when there were protests before a war was started.
It's in the last year. It's since September 11th. And he comments on that himself. I mean, it's the interviews, the requests for speaking, it's just inundated. And it's almost as if, this is my own take on it, that the desire of people to sort of hear another position in order to come to understand everything that's going on or that has happened it's just people are hungering for hearing an analysis, another analysis than the one they usually get.
You look through hundreds of years of history, the West has a virtual monopoly of violence. So massive terror is the kind of thing we do to them. They're not supposed to do it to us. September 11th was the first break. It's the first time in hundreds of years that any Western country has suffered on home soil the kind of the thing they do routinely everywhere else. And in Israel, it's sort of the same. Actually, it was pretty striking for me to see this. After September 11th, I had a ton of interviews everywhere, except the United States, of course. And often it was national radio and TV. And often a couple of times it turned out to be Irish and television and BBC back to back. And the difference in reaction was startling, And things that if I said this much on Irish TV, okay, discussion over, everyone understands what I'm talking about. Try to say it on BBC, you have to go on for like about an hour to explain to them what you mean. The Irish Sea is a chasm, and it just depends who's been holding a whip for 800 years and who's been under it for 800 years. And the same is true everywhere else in the world, But for the West, the idea that anybody should do to us a fraction of what we regularly do to them is just outrageous, and the same is true in Israel. It's a 35-year occupation. And up until very recently, they were literally immune from retaliation from within the territories. And they weren't acting very nicely there. It was brutal, humiliating, repressive, robbing the resources, kicking the people out, and so on. But there was no retaliation. Okay, last year or two, there's some retaliation. So it's scandalous. It's also considered a scandal in the West, right? Because we do it to them, it's okay, but they do it to us, it's not okay. So if Israel invades Lebanon with U.S. backing and kills 20,000 people, well, it's the way the cookie crumbles. It's not a problem. But if it goes the other direction, a couple people get killed, yeah, that's a horror story. Well, the question that I was asked is, what was the effect of 9/11 on organizing? Seems to me it was kind of a dual effect. September 11th, it was immediately predicted, and now we can look back and see that the prediction was correct, that every repressive force in the world would take it as a window of opportunity to extend what they were doing. So, for example, the Russians took it as an opportunity to extend the attack in Chechnya, pretending that it's a war on terror, and now with the authorization of Washington. The Chinese did the same in Western China. Indonesia did the same in Aceh, Israel and the occupied territories, and so on down the list. Furthermore, just about every government used it as an opportunity to try to impose greater discipline on their own populations, under, again, the pretext of a war on terror. So that's true of the more dictatorial states, like, say, Central Asia. It's also true of the more democratic societies with prevention of terrorism ordinances and other devices of one sort or another, mainly to try to discipline their own populations. These are just continuations of tendencies that are already in process, using this kind of opportunity to escalate it. And that was predictable, and of course it's happened. If you're interested in terror, you should look at its causes. Now, if, for the point of view of apologists for state violence, like the ones you're mentioning, you're not allowed to look at the causes because that's considered rationalization or justification. So if you try to look for the causes, like every sane person does, that's rationalization. What you're supposed to do is have tantrums and scream about Islamic fascism and blame it on the bad genes of the Arabs or something. But you're not allowed to look at the causes, and there's a good reason for that. As soon as you look at the causes, you start looking in the mirror. And that you have to block. The main task of intellectuals, always, but now too, is to make sure that people never look in the mirror. We never look at ourselves. They only look at other people.
The heckling, the leafleting at the door, there's, well, as you can imagine, there's an enormous amount of hostility. And the different groups will interrupt in the question-answer period, and, oh yeah, there's a lot of, that shows up often.
In fact, one useful effect of the end of the Cold War is the clouds have lifted somewhat, and reality is coming into clearer view, and it takes a little more effort to suppress what should have been obvious all along. Well, 5 years after this came the review of post-Cold War deterrence that I was quoting earlier, and now the meaning of deterrence is clarified. You have to deter those who seek an independent path. And it's only by suffering really deep historical amnesia of the kind that Orwell attributed to a properly functioning educational system. It's only by that you can fail to recognize the pedigree of this doctrine, which goes back to the end of World War II, and there are plenty of precedents earlier in the history of other imperial states. Perhaps the most instructive illustration of all of this is Cuba. It's an example which happens to be highly relevant and very timely right now. Recall we've just passed the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The anniversary was the occasion for a high-level conference in Havana of Russians, Cubans, and Americans, mostly from the Kennedy administration, and it yielded some startling information about how close the world came to a nuclear war that would have given the unwanted answer to Ernst Mayer's question. It was discovered that we were saved from perhaps terminal catastrophe by a word, a single word, from a Russian submarine captain named Vasily Arkhipov, who ought to get hundreds of Nobel Peace Prizes. He countermanded an order to fire nuclear-armed missiles from a submarine that was then under bombardment by U.S. destroyers who were enforcing John F. Kennedy's naval quarantine. That's how close we came to the end of human civilization. Okay, one word from a Russian submarine captain. That was the most dangerous moment in human history. Historian Arthur Schlesinger commented, he's Kennedy's advisor at the time, when he heard about this. Robert McNamara, who was then Secretary of Defense, he observed at the conference, as he had before, that Cuba was justified in fearing a U.S. invasion. He said, if I had been in Cuban or Russian shoes, I would have thought so too. Those facts in no way mitigate the criminal lunacy of sending nuclear-armed missiles as a deterrent, or the other interactions of that very grim month in which we almost got the answer to the question whether it's better to be smart than stupid, the wrong answer. Well, these extraordinary facts were very marginally reported in the United States. I don't know how they were dealt with here. They elicited virtually no comment. The press did, however, report that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba is no longer promoting terrorism as it did before. That follows the convention of the scholarly literature on terrorism, which highlights allegations of a Cuban role in terrorism, but manages somehow to ignore the fact that Cuba probably holds the world record as a target of terrorism for the last 40 years. It's another fact it wouldn't do to mention. That includes the terrorist acts of the top-level commanders in Washington that aroused the fear of another invasion and helped precipitate the missile crisis and came very close to destroying what we call human civilization. So it takes really impressive discipline for educated sectors not to mention these particular facts, again, Orwell's phrase, just at the moment when the awesome consequences that have been so narrowly averted have just been revealed. I looked and I could find no mention. Maybe you had lead editorials in the Globe and Mail about it and scholarly articles, but I didn't see any mention.
But for an academic to take those risks, to say the heck with my career and the heck with disciplinary boundaries and the heck with being liked by everybody and getting good reviews and being praised by my peers, I'm really just going to say what I think is true and dedicate my life to that. It's very sad to say that there's only a tiny minority of academics in universities that do that. And we begin to realize what a crime that is when we see that these are the people who have access to facts, who have the training to interpret them and make sense of them, who have privilege, in our country at least, to communicate those facts to others, and instead they frequently concentrate on advancing their careers, perhaps I should say we, on advancing our careers, on speaking in arcane language that ordinary people can't understand, on erecting disciplinary fences so that nobody who wasn't trained in our discipline is allowed in. And he has no time for that. He has contempt for disciplinary boundaries. If he wants to learn economics, he studies it. If he wants to talk about history, he studies it. So we have somebody who is an intellectual and an academic, committing his life to justice, using all his intellectual resources, and not caring about disciplinary boundary. When you put it all together, it's quite an unusual mix.
Before 1968, there isn't a hint that Kennedy was trying to get out of Vietnam, because he wasn't. He was one of those extreme hawks in the administration. The declassified record shows that very clearly. After 1968, all these guys rewrote the stories, and it turns out that Kennedy was struggling to get out of Vietnam, and he thought the war was awful, and and then this bad Texan came in after him and escalated it. It's total nonsense, and you can see it when you compare what they were doing beforehand. Like Arthur Schlesinger wrote a day-by-day account of the 1,000 days. Not a hint there that anybody was even thinking of getting out of Vietnam. The issue never even came up. Afterwards, Kennedy was a real dove, wanted to end the war and so on. And then by now there's a whole industry of people, mostly on the left incidentally, trying to prove that Kennedy was trying to get out of Vietnam, and that's why he was assassinated and so on and so forth. Kind of the Oliver Stone type business. It was totally false, And but that's the picture that intellectuals construct of themselves post hoc. And since they're the only one, they're kind of like the custodians of history, it ends up that way. That's still be in the textbooks and the history books and so on. You want to find out the truth, you're going to have to go back to the original documents. You go to the Russell archives. You'll find out what it was really like. But you're not going to find it in the history books. So be cautious when you hear about intellectuals being fighters for justice.
They sort of, when I look around the audience, the sort of rapt attention. I mean, the kids, they're leaning forward in their seats. And it doesn't come from anywhere else.
In 1988, I guess I sort of naively, I knew he was well known, so we put up a simple poster that just said sort of Chomsky, assuming everyone would know who that is, and kind of gave the time and place. We had it in the biggest room that we normally put people in, and we also rented the room next to that so they could have a live audio visual feed. We ended up having it on the same night as the major lecture series for McMaster, the Wooden Lectures. A very famous man came to do that. Despite all that, there was no way people could get into those two rooms. A lot of people were disappointed. They were standing, they were sitting in the aisles, everything else. So there were lots of people that time, but not as many as this time. And it's partly the book 911, it's partly the events of 911, it's partly the fact that things he's been saying for years are becoming more and more obvious to people, and he was prescient, he saw what was happening. And his fame was great then, and it's greater now.
What would the demographic mostly have been of people who were getting the tickets?
It was across the board. It was students, it was professionals. We had people from pretty much all walks of life, and people that we hadn't seen before at the store. So it wasn't just regular customers, it was people from all over the city.
Perhaps some of the youthful support for Professor Chomsky is looking for a figurehead, if you like, to focus their own feelings or critiques of many of the issues he's dealing with. I think if that kind of adulation, if you like, is focused on Professor Chomsky specifically, it's something that he would personally be very uncomfortable with and would do his utmost to discourage, given that issues of substance itself that need to be addressed.
It is extremely difficult to keep, especially 9/11. I mean, we've always sold steadily the Chomsky stuff, and I think being close to the university has always helped that. And there is sort of an undercurrent in Hamilton of activism that people don't always see and they're not always aware of. So Chomsky has always sold steadily for us, but 9/11, because it's on so many people's minds, has sold extremely well. I think it is actually officially our best-selling book ever. And considering that it hasn't been available for all that long, I mean, that's extraordinary.
But there is the fact that there is a small percentage of people who come simply because they've heard that it's big. Like someone was telling me the other day, they heard someone saying, "Oh, I hear this guy's Chomsky's coming, so I've got a ticket, and I don't know who's opening for him, but I hear." They thought he was a rock star.
The hardest part is exhaustion for him. I mean, actually, part of the reason that I go is to sort of intervene as a, I mean, when it became sort of a rock star reception and fuss and bother, he really needs a manager to shepherd him around and to turn down adding something else and so on. And the question really was whether to hire a manager. And so the first thought was, well, I had just recently quit working. I mean, I had retired. And to see that I should go, the first trip, I mean, which was to South America. And, I'll go along and I'll see if it works. Maybe it won't be so great for his wife to, but he said, yeah, try it, let's see. So I did, and it worked. In fact, it was very funny. In the Argentina portion of that, they're very laid back in sort of Latin American style. Nothing starts on time, and it's all. And I would, cut things off at the time and on to the next and so on. And I had the feeling I was interfering all the time and really getting in their way. And I just did it. I mean, it had to be done. And at the end, when they gave their big thank you speech at the final event, and thanked Noam and so on and so forth, I was really amazed that the guy in charge with whom we'd been negotiating the whole time said, and we also want to thank Carol for keeping us on track, and without that discipline, we could never have gotten through everything we had planned for this trip. And I was just, the idea that in any sense I won't say he welcomed it, but that in any sense he found it a positive thing for his own purposes. So I thought, well, okay, if that's the way it's going to be viewed, then I guess it's all right.
This is too obvious to mention, but he's obviously a very, very gifted man. He's very smart enough to marry Carol Chomsky, who is a wonderful person. I guess I could equally well say she's smart enough to marry him. They are a real powerhouse.
It's very funny in some of these situations. The last trip, which I did not go on, the schedule said he is to have a half an hour alone in a room with no interruptions. And when he got back, he described how somebody sat there with him the whole time. And several times students knocked on the door to have books signed. And the person who was with him said, come right in, and he signed the book. So I was telling my son afterwards how, look what, it was clearly written there, and it's supposed to be understood. And Noam said they just don't understand. They just don't understand what it means. So my son Harry said to me on the phone, he said, what is not to understand in alone and no interruptions?
Here, one more. You gotta do one more. You gotta do one for me.
And that's it? And then you're out.
And then I'm gone. Honest to God. That's the bar.
You don't want a book signed?
Fine. Thanks a lot. Okay.
See you in a few minutes.
Please join me in welcoming